The opening of the canvas could not have been better, and in the choice that we made for a keynote speaker. It is truly for me a great pleasure to welcome to Stony Brook again the keynote speaker, Amara Lakhous. I met Amara for the first time in Florence about 6 years ago, when we organized a conference on immigration at the Florence University of the Arts. It was one of those meetings, one of those encounters that you feel working a certain chemistry, binding chemistry, and we right away, we glowed. And we have become, if I may say this, great friends. Since then, he has come to Stony Brook. He has spoken to my class, to my students in HUI 239, and then he has come 3 additional times. Already came over here in September with the presentation of the book. Amara was born in 1970 in Algeria. The 6th of 9 children. You beat us. We're 8, but I'm the 2nd. After finishing school, he decided to study at the Faculty of Philosophy in Algiers. He went on to work for an Algerian radio, where, like many of his colleagues, he had to put up with repeated threats. In 1995, with the manuscript in his luggage, he moved to Rome. In Rome, he enrolled in the Department of Cultural Anthropology, and he received a degree from the University of Rome. Let me say this, that he represents a difference in the group of writers to Europe from Africa. Many of them moved and are moving from colonial countries to Europe. And they moved to the countries with which they are connected. Amara went from Algeria to Italy, and therefore he has created a narrative that is unique. His narrative reflects, in many ways, Italy that changes. An Italy seen through the eyes and the soul of a Mediterranean on the move. The manuscript, which he had written in Arabic when he was 23, was published 4 years later in a bilingual edition, from Le Cimici e il Pirata to The Bog and the Pirate. His second book was published in Italy in 2006, Scontro di civiltà per un ascensore a Piazza Vittorio, with English translation and very successful here in America with the title of Clash of Civilization over an elevator in Piazza Vittoria. I know that we don't have time, Amara, but let me tell just my students. Piazza Vittoria is very close to Termini Station, the main railway station in Rome. It's, in fact, when you take subways, stop after. And when you come out from the subway, you think that you're in a different world, right? And it's one part of the assignment for my students, to take the subway and say, go up. And they come up and they try to report, certainly, because it's really a big revelation of what happened over there. And he lived in Piazza Vittorio for about, I think, 4 years. Now, he looks for the theme of identity in a multicultural environment. Now, what is also relevant is the mixture, how he has been able to, with his knowledge of Arabic, certainly his first language, to enrich the Italian language with expressions, imageries, terms, and certainly this is something quite new in Italian literature. He says, I Arabize the Italian and Italianize the Arabic. In 2006, he won the Premio Flaiano, and so many prizes afterwards. Just once mention another 3 books and then I close. Divorce, Islamic Style in 2012. Dispute over a very Italian piglet, 2014. All these books have been, as you can see, translated in English, and I suggest to my students to take a pick, and you can write a report on this. He's a prolific writer who has enriched world literature from a Mediterranean perspective. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Amara back to Stony Brook.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be the Keynote speaker. And this is the first time in my life, so it's very important, the first time. Before starting, we can't talk about the Mediterranean without talking about our mothers. So because I think there is a big similarity in the Mediterranean, la mamma mediterranea, Mediterranean mother. So this is a story about my mother. Last few months ago, I gave a talk at Cornell University, and the talk was recorded like today. So the talk was in English. So I called my mother a few days later, and my mother said to me that I saw the video on YouTube, and I don't like it. I said, why? Because my mother speaks only Berber. Because I thought maybe my nephew, who speaks very well English, maybe he translated for her some concepts or theories. And she said, no, not this. So she said, in the talk, you were without a tie. And it's true. It was true. It was true. So she said, without tie, remember, son, without tie, people will not listen to you and will not respect you. So today, I decided to follow the recommendation of my mother. I would like really thank my friend Mario Mignone, because he is the mind of this conference. So we tried with many friends, Claudio Rossi and others, to help, but the maestro is Mario. Thank you so much. The Mediterranean has literally shaped my life. I was born in the seaside city of Algiers in 1970. And for the next 25 years, I looked out daily at that majestic span of water from our family's house in the city. I grew up dreaming of becoming a pirate or a sailor. I was so imbued with the Mediterranean that in 1999 and 93, I wrote my first novel about pirates, the sea, and freedom. So I called it, actually in the Italian version, because the novel was published in 2011, so I chose this title, a very little, a very small pirate, un pirata piccolo piccolo. That's the title in Italian. I was proud to be Mediterranean. Today, I have to confess, I am no longer proud. I feel shame. The Mediterranean has become a place of death and violence, in short, an open cemetery. Perhaps it is time to think more deeply about the Mediterranean and address it for the role it is playing in the world. Perhaps we need a new non-conformist narrative of the Mediterranean. The Harraga, the people who cross the Mediterranean daily at the risk of death, offers us an original perspective on that great sea. A well-known expression of the Algerian Harraga is al-hout wal ad-doud, or better to be eaten by fish than by worms in tombs. In other words, better to die on the Mediterranean than inside Algeria. I'm going to talk about Algeria, but I'm sure that there is no substantial difference between, the south of the Mediterranean. There is no substantial difference between Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, especially about young people. And actually, I had the big opportunity to live with Tunisians, Moroccans, Egyptians, and in Italy for many years. And in my novels, there are many characters: Egyptians, Tunisians, Moroccans. In my novel, Dispute Over a Very Italian Piglet, published in English in 2014, the main character, Enzo, an Italian, describes his Moroccan friend, Samir, or Sam, as someone who began dreaming of Europe as a child. Europe was so close to his hometown in northern Morocco, just a few minutes across the Strait of Gibraltar, 14 kilometers away. Sam believed that in other side in the sea, all the children were blonde and blue-eyed with straight hair, and that their parents showered them with chocolate and candy and gifts. Unlike his parents, who always had trouble making ends meet. Sam felt the world was unjust and wondered why he hadn't been brought into the world 14 kilometers to the north. What did I do wrong? He lamented. Sam finally made the crossing in a run-down boat loaded with equally disparate Somalis, Senegalese, Nigerians, North Africans, Palestinians, Kurds, Pakistanis, and more. They looked death in the face and had to be rescued at sea. God had wished Sam to be born in Morocco, to live and die there. It was his destiny, the maktub, we say in Arabic. He had been taught, but Sam had rebelled. In Italy, however, he would find not a lot of work, but a lot of despair. Hundreds of young Africans, Asians, and Eastern Europeans, I quote, packed like mice into Chinese towns, reduced to slavery in the fields and controlled by ruthless overseers, end of quotes. Italians themselves, Sam learned, were trapped between employment and the Camorra. The phenomena of the Harraga goes back at least to the time when Tariq ibn Ziyad commanded the forces that attacked the Spanish mainland in 1700. Gibraltar in Arabic, Jebel Tariq. So this is very important reference. When I was a child, his legend was glorified everywhere, in school, in the mosques, in the streets. All of us young Muslims were fascinated by the speech to his soldiers on reaching Spain and by his decision to burn the ships that had carried his army across the strait. In YouTube, there are a lot of movies about Tariq, especially the speech. So it's incredible with the sword and the soldiers, etc. It is generally acknowledged that both the speech and the cheap burning are myths, historical mistruths, because Tarak was Berber, so the speech is in very poetic Arabic. And in general, the speeches about, in that situations are full of references to Quran and Hadith, the recommendations of the Prophet. So in the speech of Tarak, there is no mention of Quran, so it's not true. But people believe in this speech. However, there are highly motivational passages, and the effect on us as youngsters is easy to imagine. I will quote a few lines from that famous speech to give you the flavor. It will be great to study this speech. It's really interesting. So this is just a very small, very short passage. "Oh, my warriors," Tarak says, "whatever would you flee? Behind you is the sea, before you the enemy. البحر أمامكم والعدو خلفكم وراءكم. Put far from you the disgrace from which you flee in dreams, and attack this monarch who has left his strongly fortified city to meet you. Here is a splendid opportunity to defeat him, if you will consent to expose yourself freely to death. Do not imagine that your fate can be separated from mine, and rest assured that if you fall, I shall perish with you or avenge you." And here, this is a very interesting passage. "You have heard that in this country there are a large number of ravishingly beautiful Greek maidens. Their graceful forms are draped in sumptuous groves on which gleam pearls, coral, and purest gold, and they live in the palaces of royal kings." It's very interesting. It's really interesting. It's like paradise. The phenomena of immigration cannot be explained solely by poverty or lack of opportunity. The Harraga suffer from a mix of sociological, historical, political, and personal factors. One of the essential explanations for the Harraga's flight is what the Algerian specialist Susan Ruta, is my friend, she's an American friend. She published 5 years ago a wonderful novel called To Algeria with Love. And the novel was translated into Italian by Einaudi, La Repubblica di Wali. It's an incredible story. So Susan lived in France, in Paris in the 50s, and she met a lot of Algerians, and she felt love in Algeria, and she read all the books about Algeria. She never went to Algeria, but she knows incredible things about Algeria, incredible things. So rightly pinpoints as Hogra. Hogra is, so we are talking about Harraga and Hogra. Hogra is Horgra. As Hogra or contempt. This is very Algerian word. So Algerians invented two words, Harraga and Hogra. It's incredible, two words, and there is no other words in Arabic language. It's a really Algerian production. It's very incredible. So as Hogra or contempt, in an excellent article on the Algerian lexicon, Ruta reminds us that, among other reasons, the Harraga risk everything, including their very lives, in order to escape Hogra. Or contempt. I quote her, "Insult to injury, you might say, except that Hogra describes an attitude that condones and propagates violence against the many, the laissez pour compte, the forgotten masses." End of quote. In 1989, I enrolled in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Algiers. I wanted to start thinking for myself, to think with my head. The answers that my society provided for me were not convincing. I needed to develop my personal vision of the world. I had to confront a very contradictory reality. We had a religion in crisis, a political crisis, a society in crisis, and family code that severely penalized women. From this confrontation, my novel, A Very Small Pirate, was born. In 1993, terrorism was making its arrogant entrance in Algeria, becoming a part of our daily lives. Nothing good was in the wind. The military, through the imposition of a state of emergency, intervened to save democracy. But in reality, they were saving their personal interests. It's the same scenario today in Egypt. It's identical. But in Algeria, we lived this in the 80s. Fundamentalists, self-invented in a mission of so-called salvation, attempt to establish a Taliban-style theocracy on the shores of the Mediterranean. It's the same situation today in Libya, for example. Every passing day left death and blood in the streets, pessimism and defeatism in the heart. All that was necessary was a bit of lucidity to realize that we were in the middle of civil war and that the worst was yet to come. The former freedom fighters from the War for Independence had taken possession of the revolution that had driven out the French colonial regime. Fundamentalists, in turn, had taken possession of Islam and considered all those who disagreed as disbelievers to be fought against. And actually, this is the main idea in my thesis. So in Italy, I did a PhD about Muslim immigrants in Italy, and my conclusion is that we can't reform Islam in Muslim world. Because we have two powers, we have dictatorships in one hand and fundamentalists in the other hand, and I think they play in the same game. They are in the same game, so we can't reform Islam, and I'm so convinced about this. And in West, in Europe, there is a possibility to reform Islam. This is, I think, the only possibility that we have. In 1994, I graduated from the university and started working at the Algerian National Radio. So Mario mentioned this, it's okay. So in 1999, I spent all my savings to print the manuscript, publishing in both Arabic and Italian, the Very Small Pirate. I saw it as a moral obligation to my friends who had been murdered, who had been sacrificed on their altar of inhuman folly. The basic idea, this is very important, the basic idea of that novel was suggested to my younger brother, Hamid, a young genius gifted with the ability to read reality in simple yet profound way. Hamid often asks me peculiar, curious questions. One day, we were in the beginning of the 90s. One day, he looked at me and declared, "Whoever's born on February 29th lives time in a really strange way. He jumps from 4 to 8, 8 to 11, and so on." My brother's remark blew my mind. It was precisely what I wanted to write about. A character who is in crisis because he suddenly feels his age, his very existence has been stolen. This is the metaphor of my generation. Out came the main character of my book, Asino, a postal worker who is 40 years old but does not know it because he was born on February 29th. Without notice, he went from the 36 to 40 and felt robbed of his life like so many people of my generation. For Muslims, 40 is the age of the prophecy. Since the Prophet Muhammad received the divine revelation at the age of 40, it should be the age of maturity, the full realization of stability. But Hasino is unprepared, frightened, and does not see how to move ahead. He is still a bachelor, a situation unacceptable in Arab society, for it is thought that it may conceal homosexuality or impotence with its attendant burden of shame. 40 years also serves as a poverty index, since men, according to tradition, must bear all expenses related to an engagement and marriage. The institution of marriage is seen as a market, an auction where the highest bidder takes the prize, the rich, who can afford young and beautiful wives, and the less fortunate, who can occasionally frequent a prostitute, like Hasino, the main character. They are all mercenary relationships, paid love, that on occasion overflow and become real emotional bonds. Cut from marriage, Hasino is excluded from all walks of life. He cannot boast of societal or political connections. He cannot offer services in exchange for other rights, duties, privileges. Even illegal acts can be treaded on it in the open in such a corrupt society. The state of law cannot survive. Dictatorships are not born out of nothing. They are the result of favorable contexts. In Arab society, Hasino's category of men has greatly enlarged. A super rich oligarchy has formed, be the relatives of the president, his ministers, the other powers that be, while the majority of population, like Hasino, is isolated, lacking in support and stability. He lives with the fear of being fired from his job, kicked out of the whole of a house in which he survives. The three main taboos of the Arab Muslim society with which Hasino grapples are politics, religion, and sexuality. Actually, there are the three reasons of the illegal immigration. So these three. Here we have the portrait of an entire generation and a country. Algeria, a country that somehow anticipated the marasma of the Arab world today. Religion, and we are very lucky actually as Algerian, because if the civil war was in the 90s, we were in very trouble. It's like Libya today. We were isolated, and it was actually a good opportunity for us, but we paid a high price, a very high price. Religion is an historical constant in which Hasino seeks refuge, especially in times of loss and fragility. One wonders why Arabs are so overtly, sometimes obsessively marked by religion, or at least by its more formal aspects. We might look for the explanation in the nature of dictatorial power. Perhaps a lighter dictatorship would lead to a lighter weight of religion. According to Muslim tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is quoted as saying, There are those on whom all judgment is suspended. The sleeper, until he wakes up. The child, until he reaches puberty. And the madman, until he comes to his senses. Asino, the main character, incapable of dealing with the reality of the country where corruption and repression reign free, wears all three of those masks. The three conditions in which no human being may be liable to judgment or punishment. In that, the conditions of problem, of freedom, of choice, and decision are absent. Sleep, being an escape from reality, nothing is risked. It allows one to hide away. The condition of the child is that of happiness and innocence. That of madman is a condition of elusive freedom. They pay a high price since they are ignored and ridiculed. As a child in Algiers, I often crossed paths with a man walking in the streets who would stop and espouse criticism on President Houari Boumediene, died in 1978. Of course, he was a dictator. So he spotted exactly the same criticism as my father and my uncles did in the safety of their homes. No one trusted that man. It made me wonder if only the insane were truly free. I built the character of the Hasino and a double channel of communication. Everything that Hasino does not have to strength or courage to challenge in public falls in him in private. In the inner monologue, sometimes dialogue with his alter ego, his veiled shadow, who he calls Fertaz, the blood one, becomes the only person he can trust. He would like to become a pirate or Harraga, pirate like his ancestor, the corsair, Rais Hamidou, but he remains a very small pirate. In a democratic country, citizens have faith in institutions, parliaments, the judiciary, the press. Hasino trusts nothing, is afraid of everything. He fears the dictatorship, dares not mention it, but carries on an obsessive monologue in which he blends history and mythology, drama and nightmare, reality and fiction. He appears insane, mentally ill. This was exactly my impression inside Algeria and Arab world, of course. All around me were a mass of people liking equality. Dictatorships produce masses of frightened, sick, and humiliated individuals. Dictatorships bring out the worst in people who set about inventing ways of survival through pathological self-censorship, self-repression, and self-humiliation. So I'm talking about Algeria, but it's true to in Algerian Joke, I'm fascinated by jokes, especially Algerian jokes, but my wife Stephanie is American and she hates my jokes. It's Algerian. She said very masculinist and she is very feminist, so no jokes. So just this joke, Algerian joke, but it's not against women. An Algerian joke from the mid of the 80s comes to mind Humor, this is interesting, humor is the release valve under dictatorship. There are a lot of, jokes under dictatorships. And I read once that the Egyptian president, the previous Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, assassinated in 1982, used to listen to the Egyptian joke in the morning before reading the newspapers, because joke, especially in dictatorship, is a good source to understand the humor, the mood of the people. It's interesting. So. Former Algerian President Chadli Ben Jadid passed away, I think, 2 years ago. Is enraged. He convokes the General Secretary of the sole political party, the FLN, and shows him the foreign newspapers, Figaro, Le Monde, the New York Times, The Guardian. All of them speak ill of him, calling him a ruthless dictator who oppresses his people and staffless dissident. At the same time, in Tunisia, and it happened actually in the middle, I think in 1984, there were big protests in Tunisia. So at the same time in Tunisia, people are taking to the streets in a protest. Chadli considers that the fact that no one in Algeria is taking to the street to express dissent against him, against his regime, puts him in a bad light. So he decided to silence the foreign press by inciting popular uprisings. The FLN General Secretary advises him to do as Tunisian did, raise the price of bread. It happened in Tunisia, actually. So he does so, but there is no reaction. He raises it a second time. Still no one takes to the streets. The foreigner press continues to speak ill of him. So the president cannot bear to be the president of nation of courts. So he summons the people to Martyr Square. This is the largest square in Algiers. There he insults the crowd and declares that the Algerian people do not deserve a president like him. This is disrespect. He takes the decision to hang everyone, no exceptions. At that point, off in the distance, a hand goes up. The president, pleased that someone has the courage to speak up, invites the citizen to come to the stage. So the president urges him to talk. So the man asks for a simple explanation. Since everyone will be hanged, will the president provide the rope for the noose, or will the each have to bring their own? This joke captured the state of resignation besetting the Algerian people at the time. So I grew up under dictatorship. I can say honestly, I prefer that dictatorship in Algeria in the 70s. We had one newspaper, one channel TV, and the censorship was very clear. The game was very clear. Instead, today in Egypt, for example, we have dictatorship, democracy dictatorship. So we have, many channels, we have fake freedom, but in reality is a dictatorship. I prefer that dictatorship. In October 1988, young Algerians took the streets and destroyed the emblems of the state's ministries, party headquarters, and police stations. Within no time, the state killed the revolt with mass arrests and torture. The army fired on demonstrators, bringing about an irreparable rift. Faced with a popular uprising, the nomenclatura decided to institute a semblance of democratic reform, without, however, solving the basic problem of the country: corruption, nepotism, the concentration of the wealth. To this day, Algeria remains a rich country with a poor population. A rich country with a poor population. In 1992, 4 years later, civil war broke out. In 7 years, more than 150,000 people died. The question remains, who killed those people and why? So the narrative of Harraga is based on two ideas. In one hand, is based on the contempt, hugra. I try to describe, the atmosphere. Because Harraga, or illegal immigrants, are not are the result of the situation, of this situation. I mean, they need freedom and bread. Not just bread, but freedom and bread. So this is in the south of Mediterranean. Now, I'm going to talk about the north, because I spent half of my life in Algeria and almost 19 years 50 years in Italy. So half of my life in Algeria and half my life in Italy. So I'm a good observer. So now I'm going to talk about the north of the Mediterranean. So about hypocrisy, actually. So hypocrisy. So to quote the Italian writer Leonardo Sciascia, quote, "Ours is a country without memory and truth. For this reason I don't want to forget. Il nostro è un paese senza memoria e verità, e per questo non voglio dimenticare." So like Sciascia, I want to remember. So I escaped from Algeria to Italy in 1999, and I lived as a refugee for 9 years. So in my novel, Divorce Islamic Style, published in 2010, in Arabic and in Italian, I narrate the story of Giuseppe Garibaldi's sojourn in Tunisia. The hero of the two wars, because he was leader of unification in Italy and in Brazil. So for this reason, we called him l'eroe di due mondi. So Garibaldi arrived in Tunisia in 1848. In 1844, in 1834, to escape death sentence for insurrection pronounced by a court in Genoa. He spent a year in Tunisia capital under the assumed name of Giuseppe Pane, and worked for the Bey of Tunis. He later moved to Brazil, where he supported the independence movement against the Portuguese and Spanish. In 1859, he returned to Tunis, but the authorities denied him enter following an intervention by the French consul. I think of Garibaldi and the hundreds of Mazzinians, Giuseppe Mazzini, political opponents in Tunisia, who enjoyed the protection of the Bey of Tunis at a time when a death sentence was hanging over Garibaldi's head. No one ever thought of giving the refugees up to Savoy. In contrast, in February 2003, a team of CIA agents in Milan seized in broad daily light Imam Abu Omar, a 40-year-old Egyptian who had been living in Italy since 1999 with political refugee status. He had been suspected of ties with international terrorists because of his militancy in the Egyptian organization called Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, Islamic group, and his participation in the war in the former Yugoslavia and on the side of the Bosnian Muslims. Abu Omar was delivered to the American military base in Aviano and subjected to torture and interrogation. The following day, he was secretly flown to Egypt, to the abominable Torah prison in Egypt, where he spent 14 months of incarceration and more torture. Abu Omar's wife reported his disappearance to the Italian police, but no trace of him was found. Finally, in April 2004, the Egyptian authorities released him, and Abu Omar repaired with his wife and friends from Milan. Italian judges who had begun intercepting his phone calls opened an investigation, and the case of Abu Omar burst into the public domain. In 2005, the prosecutor in Milan ended the investigation by charging the CIA agents with violating the sovereignty of the Italian state. The question remains, however, how was it possible for a political refugee to be handed over to his country of origin? I'm really obsessed with, with the refugees because I was a refugee. So instinctively, I remember Giuseppe Garibaldi, who enjoyed the protection of the Bay of Tunis alongside hundreds of other political refugees. Today in Europe, hypocrisy resigns where the Harraga are concerned, in particular those originating from Syria. Although state constitutions across the European Union guarantee the right of refugees, most countries do not respect their own laws. The Geneva Convention on Refugees is now 64 years old. It has been ratified by 145 countries, including all the European countries. Rules are practices, however, such as the rejection of refugees that deprive them of the right to present requests for asylum are current. It is no state secret that there are hidden waiting rooms in the airports of European capitals, and personally I had the experience, where those requesting asylum are placed in quarantine awaiting to be returned to their place of origin, often to the very country which they have fled, endangering their lives. Violations do not only concern the international convention, but the EU's various constitutions. Article 10 of the Italian Constitution, for example, states that a foreigner prevented in his own country from exercising the democratic freedoms guaranteed by the Italian Constitution has the right to asylum in the territories in the Republic in compliance with conditions established by law. The deportation of foreigners accused of political crimes is forbidden. I believe, this is very important, I am so proud, really, so proud of me, because I talked about this idea in Italian Parliament when I presented my novel Dispute Over a Very Italian Piglet. I believe laws must be applied even when we consider them in fire. Such was the great lesson taught by Socrates when he refused the escape from prison and saved his life so as not to break the law, on the basis of which be respected without subterfuge. Every foreigner arriving in Europe must be permitted to present a request for asylum. And today, actually, the situation is really clear, because in the past, they invented economical refugee. And they were actually refugees from Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia. Today, they can't say the same thing with the refugees. They are refugees. So every foreigner arriving in Europe must be permitted to present a request for asylum. This is a constitutional right. The commission appointed to examine requests will then establish whatever one has the right to refugee status and protection. There is no choice but to apply the law until such time as it is changed or repealed. So we can't, I say this, I always say this in Italy, everywhere, we can't have Article 10 in our constitution, because I'm Italian, and we can't respect it. This is, I mean, a big trouble. So in conclusion, the distance between the two banks for the Mediterranean is only 14 kilometers, the length of the Strait of Gibraltar. The reality, this is false. The real distance is much longer owing to colonial memory, misunderstandings, fear, etc. What do we have to do to reduce the distance? I believe we have to create a real dialogue between societies, between memories, between cultures, between societies. I believe more in dialogue between societies, not between governments. Being both Algerian and Italian, belonging to both shores of the Mediterranean, I have always thought just that. As a writer, I try to oppose the conformist narrative based on contempt, Harraga, in one hand, and hypocrisy in the other hand. A few years ago, during a protest rally in Algeria, the demonstrators shouted, "Rendez-nous notre pays," give us back our country. Today I say, rendez-nous notre Méditerranée, give us back our Mediterranean. Thank you.